Hi, I'm Sharon Pratt, host of IPPH on Air's State of Play. IPPH, the Institute of Politics, Policy, and History, housed on the campus of the University of the District of Columbia, with the mission of rediscovering the history of Washington, D.C., while drilling down on touchstone issues of the day, issues that have perennially plagued our nation. And there are few issues more touchstone than the issue of the growing wealth divide, the economic divide in America today. And so today we have a very special guest, someone whose life mission is to address the issue of poverty and the economic divide in our country. But before I introduce our special guest, let me re-welcome our co-anchors. We have Karen Tramontano. Karen was the former Deputy Chief of Staff to President William Jefferson Clinton. She was also Chief of Staff to John Sweeney when he was the head of the AFL-CIO. She's an international political analyst and co-chair of the Senior Advisory Committee of IPPH. Welcome, Karen.
Thank you, Mayor. It's an honor to be here.
And we also have the Reverend Mark Thompson. Mark is the host of the podcast, Make It Plain. He's a regular on MSNBC, a member of the Reparations Commission for NAARC, and a distinguished member of the Senior Advisory Committee of IPPH. Great to have you with us, Mark.
Great to be back, Mayor. Thank you.
And today we are truly honored because we have with us the Reverend William Barber. Reverend Barber is an American Protestant minister. He is the president and senior lecturer for Repairers of the Breach, and he's also the co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign. Great to have you with us, Reverend Barber.
I'm so honored, and I love that name, History, Politics, and Policy, holding those, that triune together. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Well, I want to be faithful to the mission of the Poor People's Campaign and Repairers of the Breach. Is the primary focus to come up with programs and policies to help and assist people who are impoverished in our country, or is the overarching mission to inoculate our country from having growing numbers of us impoverished, especially with some of the technological changes taking place in our society?
Well, Mayor, I literally believe that it's literally about saving this democracy. I think that we began saying that we had to change the narrative and build power. And the reason we had to change the narrative is, first of all, because we don't even talk about poverty and low wealth. And when we do, we talk about it in such a small way that does not even match the numbers. So the first thing we did, we put out a study called The Souls of Poor Folk, Auditing America 50 Years After the Poor People's Campaign. What was clear is that the current poverty measure is 55 years old, and it wasn't even sufficient when it was first written. The truth of the matter is we have 140 million people living in poverty and low wealth before COVID. We had 8 million people to be added since May, but 140 million people, that's 43% of this nation living in poverty and low wealth before COVID. Now, when you disaggregate those numbers, that's 61% of all Black people are poor and low wealth, 26 million people. 30% of all white people are poor and low wealth. That's 66 million people. 68% of Latinos, 68% of indigenous people, 62 million people working every day for less than a living wage, 87 million people uninsured or underinsured. This is all before COVID. And 250,000 people dying every year, 700 people a day from poverty and low wealth before COVID. So you cannot survive as a democracy when nearly 50% of your people are in poverty before a pandemic, and that pandemic increases the poverty where we will probably be somewhere over 50% very soon. And we were already at more than 50% of our children living in poverty and low wealth before COVID.
You know, I think sometimes people don't appreciate how staggering those numbers are that you just outlined, Reverend Barber. I do want to ask Karen, since she began her career as a labor lawyer, how is it that labor isn't more front and center on this issue? Or maybe they are and I don't fully appreciate it, but in the way they were with the civil rights movement, is it that they view their role to be to organize people once they are employed as against dealing with the issue of aborting unemployment?
So it's a very good question, Mayor, and thank you. So I think philosophically and politically, labor is there. They're fighting for living wage. They're fighting to restore overtime. They're fighting for pay equity, regardless of whether people are employed, underemployed, or unemployed. They're fighting. But you know, if you look at labor historically, I mean, just go back to the 1940s, labor represented about 35% of workers in the industrial sector. In the industrial sector now, labor is at 6%. If it weren't for public sector unions, which is about 33%, you know, we would be nowhere. That just pushes the number up of union density to 11%. But just since 1983, union density has dropped from 20% to 11% of the workforce. So they don't have the power. They don't have the economic power. And their distribution, so 50% of all union workers are in 7 states. And you can guess what those 7 states are, but they're not where they need to be. You know, it's California, it's New York, it's Illinois, and Pennsylvania and New Jersey. So they have a distribution problem. They have a union density problem. So they have a power problem. And in the public sector, where their ranks are growing and the face of labor is changing, Black and brown and Asian people make up unionized workforce, but the state is going after collective bargaining. And corporations are going after collective bargaining, and the legal framework in which they're working is a 1919 legal framework. It's not the future of work. So labor is there, you know, on the issues, certainly from a public policy perspective, but they don't have the power they once have, although organized labor, if you're a union worker, as compared to a non-union worker, or said another way, non-union laborers make 80% of what union workers make. So the economic model can work, but you need power to drive that economic reality home.
Yeah.
Well, do you think if labor such as SEIU, because they're sort of a real activist organization, do you think if they got involved more, Reverend Barber, that would help? Because those numbers you gave us are staggering. You would think this would be the issue in America today.
Well, not only should it be the issue, I mean, and by the way, SEIU is one of our big partners. We now have 43 state coordinating committees, and we're actually working with labor. SEIU has been right there from the beginning with Mary Kay Henry, because we're recognizing, as I said, that there are 5 interlocking injustices that are literally eating at the soul and the body of this nation: systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, denial of health care, the war economy, where we spend 54 cents of every dollar, 54 cents of every discretionary dollar into the war economy, and less than 16 cents of every discretionary dollar in our government to education, infrastructure, and healthcare and wages, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism. And these are interlocking injustices. If we had time, I would talk about how they're all connected. And for instance, when you talk about systemic racism, if you just took racist voter suppression, every state that is a racist voter suppression state is also an anti-union state, an anti-expand healthcare state, an anti-living wage state. And so then voter suppression is targeted at people of color, but when the people who benefit from voter suppression win, they actually pass policies that hurt white people too, and in the large majority. So we have to start connecting racism to a plan for economic disenfranchisement of all people. But here's what we also have to own. the March on Washington, one of the agenda items was $2 an hour, a living wage. Today, that would be 15. Today, that would be 15. So we still have not completed that, right? And it was $2 then, it was 15 today. We have to remember that civil rights organization and labor walked away from Dr. King when Dr. King said we have to connect racism, militarism, and poverty. We have to look at the fact that we decided for some reason to adopt this language of working class, those striving to get into the American dream. And what has happened to our political debates, we don't even talk about poverty. Think about the last time you've had a debate for just 30 minutes at the presidential level where the issue of poverty and low wealth was even discussed. And what has that done in terms of power? In 2016, there were 64 million poor and low wealth people who were eligible to vote. We just did a study called Unleashing the Power of Poor and Low Wealth Voters with Columbia University. And what we found, Mayor, is there are 3 reasons they don't vote, from whether it's Appalachia or Alabama. Number 1, the people poor and low wealth said nobody talks about our issues. Number 2, transportation, they can't get off work. Number 3, voter suppression. So what happened in 2016, 29 million of the 64 million voted, but 34 million did not vote. How do you walk away from that kind of block, especially now that we know in 15 states, if just 1 to 19% of poor and low wealth people who didn't vote in 2016 would vote, they could change the political elections from the presidency through the Senate, through the Congress. This year, for instance, and we just put out a 13-point plan for the Biden-Harris. I'll lay it out in a minute if you ask me about it. But what we just found out, the early numbers say 55% of poor and low wealth voters voted for Biden-Harris. They dared to talk about systemic racism and living wages. 6 million more poor and low wealth people voted. We contacted 2.5 million ourselves in our campaign, but that still means that 29 million didn't. So if in this country, whether it's labor, moral leaders, if we don't build from the bottom up and begin to engage that block, that's the only place you can expand the vote in this country right now, is among poor and low wealth people. Right. And to leave 64 million people unaddressed, untalked about, by having this language about the middle class and neoliberalism and trickle down, which the Pope just recently called magic. He said we keep trying magical formulas rather than doing what we really ought to do, and that is a poor people's movement from the bottom up.
Well, Mark, let me ask you, I mean, we've had activism with the Women's March, we've had activism with Black Lives Matter, and yet Congress went on recess with more and more Americans unemployed, not even stimulus money in the middle of a pandemic. Where is the activism around this issue?
Well, I think that the activism must, at least for the next couple of months, well, month really, we really have about a month, absolutely intersect with voting. There's a practicality to any of these movements, and we know Bishop Barber and the Poor People's Campaign and others have been registering voters, getting out the vote. That's important because that activism does not lead to what we know has to happen in Georgia. Then a lot of that is for naught. And we know how entrenched the likes of Mitch McConnell are. He will not move on anything, and that will remain the case. So I think that's really what's happening. And as I'm listening to Karen and Bishop Barber, I would encourage the audience, when you are not listening to and watching State of Play, there's a new documentary, a mini series on the network Showtime called The Reagans. And Mayor, a lot of our mutual friends are in it talking about it. And it is at that time we see the assault on labor unions and the assault on poor people, and how that became ingrained in the politics of America, and particularly the Republican Party. And people don't think about this. It was only 12 years between the martyrdom of Dr. King and therefore the Poor People's Campaign, the original Poor People's Campaign, and the election of Ronald Reagan. That's not a lot of time. That's just 12 years. And so we've got to reverse all of that was put in place. And I know I'm thankful, as many are, that Bishop Barber has had the courage to pick up where Dr.
Yes.
King left off.
Well, I'm going to ask him to follow up on that, but first I want to ask Karen this. We're seeing massive changes, a disruption in our economy. I mean, we're already dealing with these staggering numbers that what Reverend Barber's talking about, but there are some people who suggest with artificial intelligence, anywhere from 35% to potentially 47% of the jobs we know today will be gone, absolutely gone in 15 years. Just think if you have, driverless cars and trucks, FedEx, UPS, Uber, those jobs are gone. What do we do about, losing having that kind of massive disruption in our society? Do you think America's ready to step up to the plate?
Well, it's a global issue. And listen, we can decide we're going to handle this the same way, the barons of industry handled this during the Industrial Revolution, right? Work people literally to death. And then when there was so much labor strife and fear among these same barons, they created the ILO, an international labor organization that had governments, industrialists, and labor unions, and finally come to terms with what standards would be, what a phased-in transition would be, what a living wage would be, what health and safety protocols would be. But, the titans of industry waited far too long to decide that it was the right thing to do. Now there are many, many studies about the future of work. The Global Fairness Initiative, an organization I founded, is involved in one of them. We know the policies that need to be put in place. Universal income, universal health, lifelong learning, skills mastery instead of profession mastery. We can do this if we are intentional about not wanting the devastation of which you are describing. Or we can wait for the devastation to happen and try to figure out how to clean up the mess we have created. But one of the things that we know globally and we know as a nation is that work with dignity is of key importance to individuals. The dignity and identity that people have around their work is essential. And we have to, with intention, know what is happening, forecast that impact, and adopt the measures that are going to put people first. So this doesn't have to happen. It doesn't have to devastate our national economy. It doesn't have to devastate the globe. But leaders have to step up because we know what can be done to phase in and ameliorate what could be just incredibly harmful to people. Devastating.
No, let me ask Reverend Barber, do you think the heads of major tech companies ought to weigh in and become partners with you in addressing these really tough, staggering issues?
They should, and there are some that are doing just that even now. On June 20th of this past year, we talk about activism. We were planning on being in the street. We had a Congress, Poor People's Congress last time, put forward a budget before the Budget Committee in the United States Congress, and we had scheduled to have a major gathering. We didn't do it because of COVID. And one of the things that people are not talking about with COVID, for instance, we say people are dying. That's true, but it's also a deeper truth. It's poor and low wealth people that are dying. That's who's dying, because the two fissures that public health officials tell us where COVID is having its hold is because of systemic racism and systemic poverty. And we had 2.7 million people show up online in June 20. We were going to be in the street, but we couldn't because of COVID. I want you to hear that. 2.7 million people showed up. And then in September, we had 1.7 million. And we're going to do it next year because you're right. Yes, they ought to be involved. We need everybody. We need people of wealth with a conscience. We need moral leaders. We need people from the bottom up, and we are actually working with them, because here's what, Mayor Pratt, one of the things I want to drive home. When we talk about we know what to do in this moment. Now, what we just released, number one, we've got to have comprehensive and just COVID relief. We've got to have guaranteed quality health care for all and expand Medicaid expansion. We've got to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. We've got to update the poverty measures so we've got an accurate assessment. We've got to guarantee quality housing for all. We have to enact federal jobs programs to build up investments, infrastructure, public institutions, climate resilience, and energy efficiency among poor and low wealth communities. We must protect and expand voting rights, including statehood for DC. We must guarantee safe and quality, full funded, equitable public education that supports protection against resegregation. We've got to have meaningful immigration reform, including access to public benefits. We've got to protect all indigenous rights. We must repeal specific provisions of the 2017 tax law that benefits Wall Street and corporations at the expense of poor and low wealth people. We have to reverse every executive order of the previous administration that has exacerbated racism, poverty, denial of health care, unjust immigration enforcement, and climate devastation. And we must redirect the bloated, unnecessary parts of the Pentagon budget going to the war economy and instead use it to fight COVID, poverty, invest in healthcare, jobs, and infrastructure. Now, the question though we have to ask is who benefits from not doing this? And that's where we have to examine the corporate benefit. Who are the corporate barons that benefit if you let the society go to hell, and then they turn around and end up benefiting off of the fix as well? It's kind of like what we see happening with COVID now. Instead of us having the vaccine developed by the government or under government guidance so that it would be free, it's within the corporate structure now. So then people will turn around and charge people, which is ungodly and immoral. So yes, we need everybody at the table, but we also have to let folk know this is not just about doing good things for poor people. Moral policy is economically sane policy. Immoral policy is economically insane policy. We lose $1 trillion a year from poverty, child poverty. We lose $2.6 trillion a year from lost earnings because we don't have a living wage. We lose $1.3 trillion in government revenue when we lower corporate tax rates. We've lost $6.4 trillion in endless wars. And we've lost $3 trillion annually from not dealing with climate change, and 250,000 people die every year. And in addition to that, Mayor, here's the other thing. Every bad piece of public policy that hurts poor and low wealth people, which also hurts the society, has what I call a DM on the DL, a death measurement on the down low. And as activists, we've got to decide if we're going to be against death. Yes, we have to stand up when somebody shoots one of our own on camera in a racist way or lynches them by knee. But if we're really going to be concerned about death, we're going to have to stand against these policies that are killing people every day in our communities, in poor communities, Black and white and brown. I mean, killing them every day, but often they never get on camera. So one of the things we're starting to do in our movement is showing people the DM, the death measurement on the down low, and say that if we're concerned about police death, then the police are part of the state. We have to be concerned about all forms of what Dr. King called policy murder, right? That is created day in and day out, and began to show people the cost, the death cost, but also show, again, I want to keep repeating, we cannot survive like this as a democracy. You cannot have a democracy where nearly 50% of your people are living in poverty and low wealth, and you have the means to do it. $15 an hour would put 49 million people out of poverty immediately. You can't have people that close to liberation, and they know it, and they see us give trillions of dollars to corporations. Billionaires, I close here, billionaires have made $800 billion in the midst of COVID. Before COVID, we said we didn't have any money. After COVID, corporations got $3 or $4 trillion up front, just upfront money. And people saw that. And they know that the mythology of scarcity is a myth. So we cannot survive like this as a nation. And we have to have a third reconstruction in policy, not just programs. We've got to have major policy change, and we've got to have people engaged.
Well, I think as much as I wanted to ask you, Mark, about your role with the Reparations Commission, that deserves too deep a dive for me to do justice and us to do justice with our time constraints. So let me ask you, given again, how staggering this problem is, to what extent the problem is growing, and to what extent there is a narrative out here that you don't want to be too socialistic. Almost, it's hard to think you can do anything unless you have a very progressive agenda to address this issue. What do you think, Mark, of the choices that the Biden-Harris team have made so far, beginning with Yellen?
Well, I think they've made good choices. They've not made controversial choices. I think they've also made some very diverse choices. We see a lot of women, we see a lot of people of color. I think that will make a difference. We will see what the policies are. I think the Biden-Harris administration needs to listen to the movement in the streets, and also especially listen to the Poor People's Campaign, because Reverend Barber is right. In terms of an economy that needs rebuilding, it's going to take an investment in the working class and the working poor, which are practically synonymous these days. May I help you just on reparations? I'll say one thing in a sentence if I can. I had Professor Robert Hockett on with me last week from Cornell, and he talked about what Reverend Barber said, the different things that would help the economy. Even he said reparations and investment in the African-American community would help the overall economy. So all of these things, and mind you, what we also discussed, and this is very important, whether we win in Georgia or not, many of the things that Reverend Barber spoke about and reparations, a Biden-Harris administration can do from the White House without a Senate. And so I think those are things that have to be explored as well. And I hopefully the Biden-Harris administration, I think they will be poised to make just such moves. And lastly, these things really are not, if you hear what Barbara's saying, this is not really revolutionary. This is about caring for everyone in this country. And if this is going to be a compassionate administration and undo what Trump has done, we need that type of care for everyone. Well,
we do know that America has always cherished democracy, but America has always loved capitalism. And, even the American Revolution began as much because of a tax on tea and so forth. So only when we had about 30% unemployment in America with the New Deal, were we receptive to the kind of initiatives of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And as Reverend Barber pointed out, everybody abandoned Dr. King when he started dealing with economic issues. But Karen, are you hopeful and optimistic? Or Yellen has often spoken to the economic divide. Are you encouraged?
Yes, I mean, I know Janet. She is a phenomenal labor economist. She has the right instincts. I think Biden-Harris appointments with near a tandem OMB, Celia Rouse and Jared and Heather Boucher at CEA. It's a progressive group of labor economists who I think their instincts are right. And I think, getting back to what Mark said, there is a lot that the Biden-Harris administration can do. And there's a lot that they can do from the bully pulpit. Biden and Harris can take the issues that Reverend Barber has talked about and say living wage, talk about poverty, talk about the impact that not only the pandemic has had, but the economic shutdown has had. Who is dying? Who is really suffering? They can give voice, and that means a lot. Look, in the negative, we know what Giving Voice has done to us for the last 4 years. The voice of hate, the voice of systemic racism. They can use their, combined bully pulpit for good. And it's important to talk about what these issues are and talk about what these solutions should be and can be, and take action. They need to do all three of them.
Well, Reverend Barber, we're going to ask you to close it out. Are you hopeful about the Biden-Harris team in terms of helping us address this issue?
Well, I think we're still seeing who they're putting together. We're going to put this serious agenda out. When Biden came before 1.5 million people gathered on September 14th for our We Must Do More. And he came on. We invited Trump too. Trump didn't come. And he said to those people that ending poverty was his theory of change, was fundamental to his theory of change. Now he has the power. And the question will be, what do you do with it? I can tell you, I am deeply concerned when I hear people talking about we need to be centrist, because I don't even know what that is. I don't like the language of left or right. I like, let's be moral, let's be constitutional. And if you're going to be constitutional, remember, you can't get to domestic tranquility without going through establishing justice. I mean, establishing justice is first, and then you get to domestic tranquility. And then you get to providing for the common defense and promoting the general welfare. So let's not use all this side language like centrist. I mean, what does that mean? You're going to help half the people have establishment of justice? Centrist. I mean, even in my scriptures, the Bible says be hot or cold, because if you're lukewarm, God will spew you out of his mouth. And the people who voted didn't vote for centrist. They will spew these folk out of their mouths, because the one moment is we're in pain. And pain gives you an opportunity to go to the doctor. Pain gives you an opportunity to repent and say, Doc, I wasn't eating right. I didn't take my medicine right, and then get better. We have some repenting to do, Democrats and Republicans. Trump is not the only cause of this, but I will tell you that neoliberalism and trickle down and centrism is not going to get us where we ought to be. We keep hearing there must be a healing of the soul of America. Hear this today as a theologian. Soul body separation is a Greek manifestation. It is not a Hebrew manifestation. It's not how Jesus operated. It is not what the ancients taught. There is no healing of soul without working on body. So to heal the soul of the nation, you got to heal the body. You got to heal the body of the nation. And the body is sick with the lack of healthcare and the lack of living wages and the systemic racism that there's police brutality, but so much deeper in education and infrastructure development. So if you want to heal the soul, heal the body. And if 6 months from now or 100 days from now, people see their bodies being cared for, 62% of Republicans want a living wage. 75% of Americans want health care. But so I pray, my hope is that they will take the power, because we have seen, and I close here, we have seen 4 years of what evil mindset will do with power. We now need to see 4 years of what good will do with power. We've seen evil mindset use power ferociously and at a velocity that's almost deadening. I mean, almost scary, because it's like every day they're doing something. Well, it's time for good to do something every day. It's time for people that know what's right to take power and use it for good. And if people see those tangible things happening to their bodies, I guarantee you their souls will get happy. And we will raise up a new people.
No, Reverend Barber, we're so grateful. I mean, you've hit it perfectly, and I hope we all heard you clearly. And we need to be here for you and what you're doing, because thank God for what you're doing. So thank you so much, Reverend Barber. And I want to thank Karen and Mark so much again for your role here as co-anchors and your leadership on these important conversations. And also to thank our IPPH On Air State of Play audience, who can follow us at Politics Policy History or at Politics Policy One. Thank you so much. Until next week at 3 p.m., I'm Sharon Pratt, host of IPPH On Air State of Play. Thanks so very much.